So set in the late summer of 2019, Assembly follows an unnamed Black British woman who, after an elite education and successful career in the city in finance, has just received some shocking news. Over about 30 hours, we follow her thoughts, memories, and encounters from London to a grand garden party at the home of her boyfriend's parents in the English countryside. To set the scene and to hear the sound of this voice, Natasha's going to read an excerpt which takes place the evening before this grand garden party.
Thank you. Absent my phone's glow, the dark is perfect. My eyes are slow to adjust. The quiet here is absolute. I feel unobserved, though I know what is to come and what is expected of me at tomorrow's party. I understand the function I'm here to perform. There's a promise of enfranchisement and belonging, yes, a narrative peak in the story of my social ascent. Of course they, the family, even the guests, knew I could not turn down such an invitation. I will be watched. That's the price of admission. They'll want to see my reactions to their abundance, polite restraint, concealed outrage, and a base, desirous hunger beneath. I must play this part with a veneer of new millennial money coolness, serving up savage witticisms alongside the hors d'oeuvres. It's a fictionalization of who I am, but my engagement transforms the fiction into truth. My thoughts, my ideas, even my identity, can only exist as a response to the partygoers' words and actions, articulated along the perimeter of their form, reinforcing both their selfhood and its centrality to mine. How else can they be certain of who they are and what they aren't? Delineation requires a sharp black outline.
Thank you. I wanted to start here, Natasha, because I think the passage captures a larger discussion in the book about the various narratives. So here's the woman performing the story of her social ascent, performing the fictionalization, the construction of who she is. Earlier on, she says, it's a story. This is the one she's presenting to an assembly hall of schoolgirls seeking inspiration, overcoming, transcending, etc. You've heard it before. It's not my life, but it's illuminated 2 meters tall behind me, and I'm speaking it into the soft, malleable faces tilted forwards on uniform shoulders. I recite my old lines like new secrets. Several pages later of the story, she says, I'd rather say something else, something better, but of course, without the legitimacy of a flashy title of a blue chip company, I wouldn't have a platform to say anything at all. Can you tell us about the old lines, as you say, of this story, and why, as the woman finds herself increasingly lost in the narrative, why it might be perhaps time to end this story?
Thanks for pulling it all together like that. I think the assembly, which is kind of where the novel begins for me, is so key to what this is about. She's speaking to school students on behalf of her employer, a bank, encouraging them to pursue a career in financial services. And she feels conflicted about this. She's not sure it's good advice. And we as the reader feel skeptical of her message. We don't believe she's telling them the truth, or at least not a straightforward truth. We feel that she's speaking on behalf of her employer and she's not going to deliver a message that they don't endorse. And I really wanted to invite that skepticism, not just to the book, well, not just to the talk, but the book itself, because there's an expectation that a book like this is either the character's truth, whatever that means, or perhaps my truth as the writer, but it's just a product. And Penguin wouldn't publish a book that they didn't feel would sell, and they weren't comfortable with the message packaged within the book. And I really wanted to draw the parallel between what the narrator's saying in that assembly and what the book says as a whole, and encourage readers to be skeptical and approach this story with skepticism and question what it means when we see a particular character sort of put forward to represent, I suppose, a real world demographic, of course it can't be representative. And in a lot of types of literature, we don't expect that. But sometimes there's an expectation that we can pick up a book and learn a truth. And I really wanted to question that expectation, I suppose.
So the story is the literary story of the publishing world at the same time as the story within the book?
I think, yes, I think the book is very much a function of what's publishable and what was publishable at the time, and a book within those constraints. And I thought very explicitly about the broader genre that the book sits within, but also kind of the more specific subgenre. On the hardcover version of the English edition, it doesn't say this on the paperback, but the main thing it says is the narrator of Assembly is a Black British woman. And there's not a whole heap of space on book jackets. Publishers only put information there that they feel is important, they feel will help the book sell. So clearly that sentence is setting up specific narrative and thematic expectations, telling the reader what to expect. But that's quite strange. And most of the books we pick up here don't have a sentence like that on them. And I think it's interesting that it's become so normalized, and we think it's reasonable to write that on a book. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but what I wanted to do within the book is be quite aware of the presence of such a sentence and question, what does it mean for our understanding of people, particularly people as individuals, when we start to see them in this way?
Great. This is going to get to a question I have later, but it draws on this next question that I have, which is about assimilation, because I think before we move on to also questions of other stories and who tells these stories, I think it was what struck me is how the narrator, at the possible expense of herself, its agency, its flourishing, navigated this story, her life story. And again, we hear this word assimilation. She talks about it. So you write, she says, always the pressure is there, assimilate, dissolve yourself into the melting pot and then flow out, pour into the mold, bend your bones until they splinter and crack and you fit, force yourself into their form. Can you tell us about this, the protagonist's experience of this assimilation as it violent, strategic, and unsustainable ultimately?
Yeah, I think it's a word that occurs a lot within the novel, and is certainly something, one of the central, I suppose, questions that the novel is engaging with, and certainly provides a lot of interior tension for the narrator. There is this demand, this expectation, and it's used so frequently in rhetoric across politicians, journalism, this idea of assimilation. But what do we mean by it? What would satisfy? And even, I think, the idea that a person can assimilate and a person has some sort of identity that they have to hide and change is questionable as well. We're all a function of the social context that we exist within. I think for the narrator in particular, in that passage, she goes on to talk about the limitations of what's meant by assimilation. She says it means not here, not into this. She's sort of overshot what people expect when they say assimilate. They don't mean actually succeed in your career. They don't mean sort of reach some of the higher tiers of social classes in the UK. They mean fit into a sort of more traditional working class multicultural layer. And the idea that the narrator is questioning is, how exactly can you stay within such a narrow band of acceptable assimilation? It's almost as though she's fulfilled the demand too well. And kind of to contextualize that a bit more broadly, I really look at this book as being the product of kind of the neoliberal trend that was going on over the past 10, 20 years. So Tony Blair in the UK and probably Clinton in the US, but this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and this real rhetoric that was directed at people like the narrator when she was young and would have been the social context she was growing up within. And of course, it's not possible. That was originally a satirical statement, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But something changed, the economy changed in the background. And in the UK, where it's set, in the US, which is providing some of the broader context, the tertiary and quaternary sectors grew massively. And the primary and secondary sectors of the economy are raw materials and developing those into products. Tertiary is services, so selling those to people. But quaternary is something else. It's research, it's technology, it's finance, these areas where we don't know what the workers look like. But this grew massively, and there was a huge demand for workers in these types of jobs, which has led to people like the narrator populating them. And I really look at Assembly as a book that's really set in this moment of social flux. How do we as a society react to the fact that suddenly it is possible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Suddenly social mobility on the scale that we've never really seen before is possible. It raises questions for all of the characters in the book, and not necessarily easy ones and not necessarily happy ones. But for me as a writer, I felt seeing something like this playing out in the sort of dramatic situations it led to was interesting to explore.
And I think you spoke about this, how you wanted to kind of reflect on this moment of flux as the old British class system, which is really recognizable not only in Britain but around the world, starts to erode. There's the dramatic situation, there's also the space. Can you talk about the importance of space and entry into space, and who is in and who is out, and that invitation, the importance of invitation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's exactly as you say, the British class system is so well understood globally because it exists in the English literature canon, which for various reasons is read worldwide. So we're familiar with it. And of course, classes in the UK certainly aren't as clear-cut as they used to be, and there's a lot more fragmentation and it's a lot less easy to classify. But actually writing this, I was drawing a lot on Jane Austen and her social satire and satire of the classes. And a lot of her novels follow the story of, or at least have a subcomponent of someone coming from London, typically from the merchant class, and rubbing up with the gentry in a country house, and the sort of comedy of manners that comes as a result. And I hugely look at Assembly as just an updating of that story, because I think it's still a story that works in the UK. And I don't think it's new. And even within the book itself, the narrator, her boyfriend's parents, the father, the money's dwindling, we get a sense, but he comes from at least a big history. But the mother who married in, not so much. And we can imagine she had her own version of this story a couple of decades ago, and now the narrator's taking her own turn on it. I think for the foreseeable future, this Jane Austen plot essentially will have mileage. And for me, I really look at how writing contemporary fiction, I can still engage with those ideas and kind of judge what's different and what's the same. And it's completely tied to spaces, as you mentioned, in this idea of land ownership. And, in these Jane Austen novels, or all of the Victorian novels, they talk about so-and-so has however many thousands a year as their income. And that's partially made out of the property they own in the UK and partially plantations. But what's really interesting in this economic shift is land ownership in that way in the UK is no longer exploitable for a steady income like that. And it's led to a huge reevaluation of what our classes mean. And we've got this term now, the landed poor, for people who do have an estate but don't have a means of sustaining it. And I think it's a question that shows up again and again in books and television. Downton Abbey, I think, explores this explicitly. And I think the consequences of that for me are so tied to just how do we reevaluate ourselves, and how do people understand their place in society as things shift.
And this plays out too in the relationship the protagonist finds herself in, because she's in a relationship with this guy, and he comes from, as you say, this class of kind of there's not much money in the bank, but there's a huge house and there are all these assets. And she, meanwhile, is making enormous amounts of money, so much so that she buys herself a nice flat in a fancy part of London. And he kind of teases her and says, you're making so much money. And she thinks, well, this is fairly glib, because he's not really counting the wealth of all of the kind of, as you say, the landed physical assets. Can you talk about how you took this much larger discussion and brought it down to the level of, human relationship?
Yeah, I think you summed it up fantastically well, because there's income from labor and income from assets. His family has income from assets. The narrator has income from labor. We tend to, in the dialogue around wealth and taxation, conflate the two. But income from assets is not really taxed in the UK, and income from wealth is taxed hugely. And I don't really think the book is commenting on this so much as trying to just tease out what that actually looks like in reality and on an individual level.
That's great. I want to just return to this word assimilation, because you gestured towards your publisher, and this is your first book, so debut, and you hadn't published previously. I mean, you've been kind of writing and reading as a hobby on the side, you said in interviews, and I was struck by, I think like assimilation is a big word and it can sometimes cut both ways, and you described kind of how you sought to understand the rather closed world of publishing, whether in Britain or France and America. And you said that in an interview that you kind of strategically departed from familiar and recognizable, as you say, this genre of fiction to kind of get through the gatekeepers so that they would read, you know, the manuscript. Can you talk about maybe assimilation is a kind of very strong way of putting it, but the way that you try to get through the gatekeepers by mirroring possible previous literature that was already around?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I came to writing quite late. I've always been a reader, but I came to reading contemporary novels very late. And it was only really in my late 20s I started actually reading things as they were being published. And I did notice trends that I felt I wanted to explore, and I felt a novel was an interesting way of exploring those trends and of exploring this subgenre, as I mentioned. And I think the approach with the book is very much tied to just the reality of certainly publishing in the UK, which was what my experience of was. Sort of publishers don't tend to pay for adverts for first-time novelists. How you sell your book is you go out and perform it. So they want people to write books that they can perform. In other words, your book has to look passably like your own life. And so that for me was a clear constraint on what I could do with the book. But I thought, okay, how can I use that in an interesting way? And how can I start from that point and do something that I'm actually interested in doing? And I think constraints can actually sometimes be hugely helpful for creativity. And I don't see it as too much of a negative, but I think the book and its relationship to me as the person associated with it, rather than me as necessarily who I am, is a huge part of why it even exists. I think if this book, if I'd have, say, tried to publish it under a pseudonym and wasn't prepared to do publicity around it, I don't think it would be published.
Are you thinking about this as you continue to write?
I think now that it's kind of different, having done a first book, now it's a bit more free and I can write without limits in a way. I can just follow the ideas that I'm interested in and write around that. So it does feel massively freeing for fiction, but also just my personal interests. And this is more from my background, lie in computational linguistics. That's what I'm spending a lot of my time on and really enjoying. And I'm sure I'll find a nice magazine that will publish some of my dusty essays on that topic.
We're going to talk about linguistics. Before we do that, I want to talk about another big word that recurs throughout the book, which is transcendence. And I think it, again, goes in several directions, but one main direction is the kind of protagonist's dissociation from those who reduce her personhood to her body. This is the protagonist who observes, I'm quoting, observes, watches from above, experiences a detachment, an untethering of self from experience, who is practiced at saying nothing, at asking questions. On the other hand, there's the transcendence towards the end. This doesn't really give much away, but the protagonist's rejection, possible rejection of the narrative in which she finds herself increasingly complicit. So towards the end, the protagonist delighting finally in this position of transcendence as an eagle-eyed viewer watching thinks, I watch now with the benevolent patience my decision, my untethering this life affords. Can you tell us about transcendence and untethering as they work, it seems to me, in two ways in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you really drew on sort of a key metaphor for me. We don't see much of the narrator as a childhood or much of her life really at all. But one thing we do see is that she grew up living by a cemetery, and she would look down on this cemetery and feel really disconnected from the people and this real sense of distance. And then we don't have that height distance again. She's very much around people, and if anything, smaller than the people around her for most of the novel. But exactly as you say, as it kind of gets towards its end point in the narrator, well, the protagonist steps out of the protagonist role and into the narration role. She creates that sense of distance again. She climbs a hill and looks down on the scene around her and sort of ends the book right when we think it's going to start picking up. And for me, that was a really important shift for the character. And I did borrow a lot from Catherine Mansfield, The Garden Party, which is a short story about sort of a very lush garden party taking place, and someone a bit further along dying at the same time in this weird contrast. And I really liked one of the side characters in that. He had this moment of, I guess, almost transcendence she felt, because of her closeness and the juxtaposition of those two. And I enjoyed sort of reflecting that, and there's kind of a nod to it explicitly in the book in the last section. But yes, I think the untethering, as you mentioned, is absolutely crucial to that. If people don't mind spoiler chat, I don't really think the book is too spoilable.
We're not spoiling the shock, right? Or maybe
I was about to. But
you're welcome to spoil your own book.
The narrator has cancer, and she's questioning what she's going to do as a result of it. And there's a big push from her doctor to fight this cancer and be active against it and treat it as sort of a metaphorical monster she needs to overcome. And often that's seen as sort of the right thing for this character to do, whether she succeeds or fails, she should engage in this fight. But I really wanted to contextualize her illness within the broader situation. The reason, well, in the UK and the US, Black women have a higher mortality rate from cancer despite a lower incidence rate. And in the narrator's demographics, so women under 40, breast cancer, it's excess mortality. So you can't explain it away with socioeconomic background. You can't explain it away with comorbidities. There's just something that's not being measured that's causing this higher death rate. The reason the narrator is aware of her cancer so early and has the opportunity to proactively do something about it is because her employer pays for health insurance and her employer is invested in keeping her alive. In the UK, we have socialised healthcare, but it has the exact same outcome as in the US. And I really wanted to explore what it means when the only reason she has a choice is because her employer values her more than her country does. And it's not just cancer. The same disparity was seen with the coronavirus. For death in childbirth, the rate is 5 times for Black mothers. It's a much bigger problem that socially we're aware of, but we don't act upon. And I feel as a writer, it would be irresponsible to make a story where she turns it into her own personal responsibility to tackle this head on. It's something broader, and if she decides to do nothing about it, it's not really different than the women we do nothing about today who don't have the opportunity she has to engage. So for me, it was so crucial that she could step out of this false sort of fight narrative with regards to her cancer. And it was only as she appreciated that as a possibility that she could once again sort of climb this hill and regain the position she had in childhood.
So it's an amazing point, and there's a really kind of at once funny but also painful, and this is often the way the scenes happen in the book, where she's in the doctor's waiting room and her mother calls her and has this kind of thing where she says, "Oh, do you remember this person you used to play with his aunt when you were little?" And then draws her in and she goes, "Yes, yes, well, she just died." And then she does it, and you say that she often does it, and that there's this kind of tense moment where she's hearing about the deaths of people where she grew up, and she finds herself in a kind of fancy doctor's office. I think it really highlights the tension that you're describing. Okay, so I wanted to talk about another kind of major story, which is more of a backstory, but it's the history of British colonialism. And rather than kind of we might want to say in the first case, she's ready, the protagonist is ready to end the story. In this case, we might say that it's time to really tell it and to tell it truthfully. So I will read this passage, I guess. It's the incendiary passage, so I will say the incendiary words. So we hear, with breathtaking ease, the facts of Britain's non-war 20th century history have been unrooted, dug out from the country's collective memory, supplanted. Vague fairy tales of benevolent imperial rule bloom instead. How can we engage, discuss, even think through a post-colonial lens when there's no shared base of knowledge, when even the simplest accounting of events as preserved in the country's own archives wobbles, suspect as tinfoil hat conspiracies in the minds of its educated citizens? Natasha, you've said that authors are often asked to make explicit and grand statements about the world, to provide answers, to wade into politics, but that for you, this not only harms books, possibly, but creates barriers between readers. And so by contrast, you said that by creating a quiet, light, and spacious book, and anyone who's read it can testify to that, in which you notice and clarify questions, you'll draw the reader in this way. Can you tell us about this decision to approach the latter, to do the latter approach as opposed to the former?
Absolutely, thank you. I think the passage you read is contentious, and people find it political and people find it angry, all of these sorts of things. But this is uncontested historical fact. It's well aware, Britain has acknowledged it multiple times. There's historical...
After trying to eradicate it. Yes.
And there's historical documentation of the decision to literally burn the evidence at sea, and the events that actually took place. And there was also a very explicit decision to not teach this history within schools. And of course, a country can decide how it creates its own sense of self and how it creates its own sense of history. But I think the consequence of that is even a simple statement of fact, that such and such took place at such and such year, is seen as political, and is seen as an argument rather than a statement like the sky is blue, when it's as uncontested, really. And so if I want to have a character who has this as part of the broader sense of her understanding of herself and her understanding of the circumstances she's within, it can't come on the first page. You know, you can't look at that head on. You kind of have to spend a lot of time, I think, helping the reader to get to know this person, get to know the narrator, see that she's okay, and she can even be fun to be around. She seems right about a few things, even if we don't agree with her on everything. Then finally, when she introduces this, we say, okay, all right, I'll listen a bit. And it's exactly the same when we have a conversation with a friend and we don't necessarily agree, because we have that shared feeling of understanding. There's openness to what they're saying. And for me, that was really important. I think it just couldn't have worked earlier in the book. And even where it sits in the book, still for some people, it's irritating, which is, of course, a valid read on the book. But I think it's very much sort of a function of the moment now and the context it's being read within. When you go back to with Victorian novels, it's so strange how a tiny shift in social status, which seems completely meaningless to us, has huge impacts in what they think is possible between two people. It's physical, it's real to them. It's physical to them as race is to us today. But I imagine the same way that now a passage like that needs a footnote that explains what the context is, there will come a time where it will seem very strange that a passage like that could be contentious.
And yet it's a question. It's only a question. And so you know, I love this, what you said in this interview, that you just wanted to notice and clarify the questions that we're asking. So this is one of them. How can we think through a post-colonial lens when there's no shared base of knowledge? What are some other questions that were on your mind and that you continue to think about and want to kind of pose and as you say, clarify?
Well, I think language is a huge one. And exactly as you say, at the center of this for me was, can language be neutral? And how can I, as a person who's thinking in English, reading in English, writing within English. How can I assess the neutrality of English? Can we take a statement and separate its content from its context, I suppose, and the words that are being used to express it, and judge how neutral or not that statement is? I think for me, the book in many ways is a huge exploration of this question, and an exploration of how we attach meaning and weight to words and then simply can't use them in a light way. For me, you know, if I look at this table, I could describe the edge around it as an outline. That's an uncontentious word. It's a neutral word. I'm not heating up the conversation at all. But if I called it a border, even if I'm using it in exactly the same term, there's suddenly way more weight attached. And particularly if you take into account how I look, it just becomes something much more almost political. And it's that difference between outline and border, the way their meanings overlap, but their weight is so different. That was really what I was trying to explore within the book. And I'm really interested sort of beyond this book in just ways of assessing, I suppose, that neutrality or lack of neutrality.
This is great. This is because I wanted to talk about this next, which is the role and participation of language itself, which is where you go on next, kind of after the passage that I read, and you write, this is the protagonist saying, "My only tool of expression is the language of this place. Its bias and assumptions permeate all reason I could construct from it. These words, symbols arranged on the page, itself a pure, embellished vehicle for objective elucidation of thought. These basic units of civilization, how could they harbor ill intent?" You've noted, Natasha, that in addition to the influence of Bell Hooks's essay Postmodern Blackness, Claudia Rankine's Citizen and Don't Let Me Be Lonely, that Roland Barthes, since we are in France, his essay Myth Today was on your mind. You've studied linguistics, you have an interest in it. Can you tell us more about how it shapes the book and the novel?
Firstly, I admit I have a hobbyist interest in linguistics. I haven't studied it. But I think it was huge for me. I had these questions around neutrality in language and ways to approach this, and learning some basic linguistics and starting from there was an enormous, I think, just a place where I could find tools, I suppose, to approach these questions. There's an essay, as you mentioned, Myth Today by Roland Barthes, where he defines myth as a sort of appropriated sign. And what he means by that is, if we take a sign as, say, a word or a sound that we use to signify some kind of concept, he says taking the word, taking what it signifies and taking it out of its original context and using it to signify something new. And it doesn't just have to be words, it can be an image. So this is often used in advertising theory. If you take the image of a happy family and use it to sell coffee, you're sort of appropriating that idea of a happy family and using it to associate, I suppose, our feelings about that with the coffee in question. And he says the function of these myths is to transform history, so something man-made into nature, so something that always was. And for me, it was a really unifying theory of a lot of the questions that I had and how they interacted with language, and really helped to sort of clarify how I wanted to approach, I suppose, working with words and writing a novel.
It's curious that you use the word tools, because as I was reading this, I was thinking of Audre Lorde's essay, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And you know, she's thinking about content and form. And I was thinking about this as I was rereading this. And I also think there's the question of the master, the writer, you know, the writer of kind of this Western story. And there are two moments that made me think of it in particular, that I think you write so poignantly. One is this moment when she's at supper with her boyfriend's parents. I think it's one of the first times that they've met. And you write of the father, "He raised up his quill and drew me into their world. On the page of that evening, I was a part of it." And then you have this, again, doubly funny, kind of hilarious and ridiculous and also deeply sinister moment when the boyfriend feels very kind of liberated and comfortable being at home and says, "I'm going to tell you my biggest secret," to his girlfriend, that he keeps a kind of journal. And then he says, no, it's not really a journal. I'm writing my autobiography. I'm writing my biography. And every time I do anything, I ask myself, would this fit into my biography or not? His ambitions to be a politician. So there's a larger sense in the book. And more broadly, like, will this biography then fit onto the shelves of his library in this country house? There's a sense of who gets to write, and that the writers in the book, the agents, are not the protagonist. Can you also talk about the writer in this conversation of language?
Yeah, I think it's a really big question, and I think being able to write and being able to write from a place of neutrality is not straightforward. When we see the word I on a page, we understand because we've been taught at school how to interpret that. And it doesn't just mean a first person speaker. We bring some context to it. We understand. So if we pick up a book, it doesn't need to give us too much. We can just get along with it. If you're writing from a perspective that isn't that default I, there's some extra work to do to catch the reader up so they understand where we are in relation to the default I and how to understand the story. I think that's kind of one of the considerations. And I think more broadly, just when you put a book out, this is kind of the magic of it. It's no longer your intent. It's sort of what people are interpreting, the meaning they're bringing to it, the story they construct in their mind. And I think that's the power and the beauty of language, and allows us to do quite subtle things, even when the framing may not necessarily be so subtle. But it's also it's a slippery tool, I think, and it's not a science, and it's not maths. It's something less clear, but very powerful.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please? So we have lots of time for questions, and I will refer you to Emily, who will bring you the microphone, or else if you're on Zoom again, please post and we'll read it out loud. Yes, right up front.
Hi, thank you so much. I've read an article about how you, in like revision, you tried to like make it publishable, like autofiction, and I was just wondering, in your revision, how did you go about it? Like, what was your process so that you knew it could sell, but also say what you wanted to say?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of the concessions I see in the novel, ones that I made up front, because I felt they would just be necessary for it to work as a whole, so they weren't really part of the revision process. When I revised it, the big change I made was I gave the boyfriend a lot more backstory. I wasn't too interested in him as a writer. I'd kind of planned him out, but it wasn't really in the book. But I got an agent, and she said, readers would appreciate knowing more about him. And I think it's true. He serves a really important function, and a character like him is always in a book of this subgenre, because he is, in a way, an audience surrogate. He's much closer to that default I. So if we see that this guy thinks the narrator, the protagonist, is okay, this guy's interested in her, we stick around a bit more, and it's kind of nice to have him there. So I think it did benefit him to get a bit more fleshed out and a bit more life. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. It was a great book. Have you ever thought about continuing the story? Because it was like at the end, like you said, it's kind of just when you're like, okay, now I'm ready to know what's happened, then it ends. So I don't know if that's ever kind of crossed your mind, is of continuing her story.
Yeah, I think I've thought a lot about her as a character, and I think she exists for me independently of the book. But I don't know if there's anywhere for her to go. A big edit my publisher asked for from me was to have her come back down the hill and go to the party. And I had to say, no, this is literally the hill she's chosen to die on. She can't come back down. Thank you.
Other questions in the room? Don't be shy. Yes.
I'm curious about your reading journey. You said that you hadn't been reading contemporary fiction. So what was the impetus for reading more contemporary fiction? And have you kept it up? And now that you're part of this landscape, do you feel a kind of responsibility to keep up with the conversation that's being had?
Yeah, great question. It comes entirely down to bookshops and their very glittery displays that drew me in and drew me to the new shelves, and I'm so glad about it. I think I'm very bad at keeping up. I read slowly, and I read things a few times sort of before I move on to the next book. So my to be read pile is always going to be depressingly long. But I think it is just so great that so much is being published at the moment, and so much interesting stuff and different stuff, and publishers are really willing, like taking a chance on Assembly with just taking a chance on books that are a bit unusual, and at heart I think I'm really much more of a reader than a writer, and I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for a fascinating explanation of your book. I can hardly wait to read it. Since we are presenting the French one today, I wonder, I don't know if you speak French, if you were involved in the translation, but your example of contour and outline, what French words were really difficult, and did you make a decision?
Maybe we can start with Assembly. We were talking about it.
Yes, so for the title, I think there's the question of you can't, the sense I get, and I'm embarrassingly monolingual, but from the discussions with translators, is that you can't preserve all of the meanings. So it's a question about which ones are you preserving and how that works across the text. And for me as the writer, I don't think, I see translation as much more of its own new form. So I don't think it's really my place to tell the translator which meanings to preserve, more to explain the meanings that I had and to kind of let them make the decision about the best things to keep, because they have the best understanding of how it sounds, how it resonates, how it works. Like, I can't comment on those. So as Assembly, of course, as we spoke about, there's the school assembly, which is just a meaning that's hard to preserve with the other meanings of assembly, in this sense of coming together and the construction of, there's a big marquee in the book. So unfortunately, they can't all be there. I'm trying to remember, I think Yokota, who translated it, it was a while ago, I think, right? So the questions were a while ago. I can't remember the specific ones for this, but one question that sticks in my mind from the Portuguese translator was, in one point in the book, it uses the word denigrate. And this book is really concerned with sort of words and their roots and where they come from and how that affects our meaning. And denigrate, its root is to blacken. That's what it comes from. That's what it means. And in Portugal, it's a slur, and it's crass language. And she said, do I want it to be a slur, or do I want it changed to something else? And for me, it didn't feel like it ought to be a slur in that moment. So we went a different direction. But it was interesting to see, I guess, going back to that question of linguistics, the idea that I was interested in had evolved so differently in a different language. Thank you.
You mentioned that when you were writing this book, one of the things, the driving motivations, was ensuring that it would get published. One of the big sort of discussions around your book is the fact that it is short and incredibly punchy and direct. Something that I obviously also noticed. 100 pages is so short, and there's so much you pack in 100 pages. And my question is, now that you feel like you have the freedom to explore other avenues or explore things in a different manner, do you still feel like you want it to be something direct and short?
Yeah, I think, great question. I think for me, the length wasn't a compromise. And actually, I felt, for me, what was so important was the narrator doesn't have a character arc in the normal sense. Her arc for me is really going from an object to the active subject of the story and really stepping into the role of narration. And by the end, she's directing the form of the novel. She's changing the pace of it. She's directing our attention and telling us the story. And so everything in the terms of the style and the approach for me was about creating a voice that could carry this story. We get so little detail about her or really any of the characters that it's all carried on the voice. So knowing that and knowing I wanted it to be so claustrophobic, and because she has this kind of really reserved and resigned effects, and there's a humor in her voice, but also for 1,000 pages, it would be way too much. And I think even 300 pages would be pushing it. And I would have to either water her down or shift at some point if I wanted to really stay true to this character and how I heard her and how she speaks for me. It would have to be short. And then hopefully when you get to the end, you get this feeling of relief and space and opening rather than this feeling of having been absolutely crushed. Thank you.
Other questions in the room? Yes, coming back around. Was there a question up here? Did I miss that? Yes?
I was just wondering if you ever had a conversation with your publisher or within yourself about likability and making a likable or unlikable female narrator.
Yeah, great question. I think it didn't really come up just because unlikable female narrator is quite common at the moment.
We have a question on Zoom as well. Rama is interested in what you said about being inspired by Jane Austen and the kind of tropes that one can draw from this work. And so Rama wants to know how you were able to balance being inspired and informed by classical literature and that tradition without sacrificing the specific vision that you had for this novel.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think particularly on the Austen side and thinking about her style of writing, I think stylistically there wasn't too much influence because her style was just so far from the voice I was trying to write. But I think, well, that's not entirely fair. The way she uses indirect style, I absolutely adore. I adore her narrators. And it was an influence in terms of how the narrator kind of navigates. But sort of the sentence style, the sentence structure wasn't going to work for this narrator. So it had to be quite different. So for her, I felt I was borrowing themes and approaches and ways of, I suppose, creating social comedy and social commentary tied together. But with some influences, it's harder. I think Claudia Rankine, I absolutely adore her work, and I absolutely love her voice, and elements of her style would be very applicable for the narrator. So it was really, for me, with her work about understanding and being really specific about what element of it I liked. And for me, one thing in particular was the slipperiness with the voice and the perspective and the tense and the form, and how I could use that in a way that worked for the book, but was also its own thing and was also different in its own way. I like to lean into influences and embrace them and acknowledge them, but also be really precise about how I'm using them and what techniques I'm borrowing. So it doesn't feel as though I'm automatically sort of regurgitating them, but I'm actively learning from them and trying to create something new that references them. Thank you.
Other questions?
Speaking of drawing from influences before, did you draw any inspiration from your own life, or did this story come to you entirely separate to your own experience?
Yeah, great question. I think I knew the broad strokes of the narrator's life would have to be similar to mine in the sense that she works in finance. I think that's the main similarity. It's funny because everyone I know has now read this book and it's like, it's nothing like you. But from a book perspective, that kind of gets lost. And of course, it seems exactly like me, and I understand that. I think it was necessary because I think if you look at this subgenre of books, so Black female literature, that's being published currently. This wasn't the case 10 or so years ago, like Diana Evans and people like that. The narrators are always economically anxious, always underemployed or undereducated, struggling. And this idea of sort of late 20s, early 30s, career stability and sort of pausing and questioning, having that sort of quarter life crisis, just isn't something that happens in these types of books. So a lot of the books I love are all about that. I really like Hanif Qureshi, and that's what he really writes about from a male perspective. And so knowing that I wanted that to be an element of it, I wanted to write within a world that I'm aware of, my friends are aware of, that exists, but I think just wasn't reflected in media and isn't fully reflected in media yet. Leveraging that link with myself to answer that believability question was so crucial. I spoke to a journalist around the book who said to me, but it's unrealistic, Black women don't own houses. And that was the strangest thing to me, but she believed it. And I think it's that sort of, we do, of course, exist in bubbles, and it's possible she doesn't know any women who fit that definition, but I think that's how blind spots can happen. And so that sort of link to the author's identity that can be limiting and unfortunate in some ways was actually a real opportunity here, because it let me do that. And this book is quite narrow in its focus, but if someone wants to write a book now that's a sci-fi or a fantasy or a romance and starts with a character broadly similar to the narrator, they can, and they can say it's Assembly meets Final Fantasy, I don't know, take it in that direction. And I think that's of course how we grow, and how, you know, we get different ideas and they turn from new to conventional to cliche. But for me, it was a very clear and very worthwhile trade-off. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. You're talking a lot about social mobility and language. So I wondered, for the dialogue in the book, whether that was an important aspect about how you thought the characters were going to speak, or how they may have assimilated in terms of how they communicate.
Absolutely. And I think particularly we don't see much of the narrator at work, but when she's in the work environment, there's kind of three different styles of speech, I think, in the novel. There's kind of the reported speech where the narrator tells us what someone says. There's the direct speech, but not in speech marks, and there's direct speech and speech marks. When the narrator feels comfortable and feels like she's confiding in us as the reader, she does reported speech. That's her preference. When she's in the workplace, it's kind of direct speech without quotes. And also, I kind of imagined all of these people as speaking with the same voice, that sort of corporate culture you adopt. When she goes to the house, suddenly these characters are speaking to her in quoted speech. And there's that instant sort of textual difference to how it looks on the page and what these characters are saying. And then, of course, the little kind of quirks that you could put in their speech that sort of hint at it. But for me, I felt being able to use flexibility in how I treated the speech gave me another dimension to how I portrayed that. Thank you.